Hello, Unity travelers, and welcome. This is the third video in the series for creating a login page, but also just learning Unity's UI in general. In the last video, I showed you how to add a background to your UI, which is where we've left off here. And in this one, I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent, but it's still a really good foundation to help you building any UI, and that's teaching you about anchors. So to start, I've got the same scene I had before here. I'm going to open up the canvas and select our child, the child of the canvas, which is our background. And I'm going to add another child to background. So I'm going to go to UI and I'm just going to add another panel since that's what we're familiar with at the moment. And I will just call this anchor tutorial. So we're gonna do pretty much everything with this object I'm gonna do everything with this object to show you how to use anchors. So what are anchors? Anchors are a way to anchor your UI to a different part of UI, mainly the parent. So if we look at these white arrows, and actually a better way to see them would be if I switch this to this. These white arrows are our anchors. The one that's facing from bottom left to the center is our bottom left anchor, top left anchor, top right anchor, bottom right anchor. And so when we want to anchor UI to its parent, meaning if we move the parent or if we resize the parent, the child will move and resize relative to its anchor positions. So let's go through some examples to help understand that. So right now, my anchors are all in the center. If we actually look here, we can see that where they're all 0.5, 0.5. Anchors go from 0 to 1, 0 being left or bottom, 1 being top or right. So for the Y direction, it'd be top or right. For the X direction, left or bottom. Or for the X direction to be left or right, Y direction, top or bottom. Okay. So right now, if I move the parent, well, keep track of these coordinates too. This, and actually, let me resize this real quick so it's not the same size as the parent. It'll help make this a little easier to understand. And let me recolor it. So it's a little more clear. This will be our red object. If we look at its positions, it's at 0, 0. That's because the anchors are in the center of the parent. And so that becomes 0, 0. So you can see if we move the parent, it's always going to stay relative to that 0, 0 position. And if we look back at our anchor, it is still 0, 0. Okay, let's move that back. Now let's try a different anchor preset. So these are anchor presets, which are really handy to quickly set your anchors to the most common positions you would set your anchors. You can do it manually if you want, but let's say I want to set my anchors to the top right of basically of the parent object. So now my anchors for this object are the top right of the parent object. Now you can see the position is relative to those anchors. So negative 320 in the X direction, right? And negative 240 in the Y direction puts our object here. So if I move this object, you can see it is relative to our anchor coordinates. So if you want to center an object, I suggest selecting the center anchors and then just resetting the coordinates to 0. And let's talk about why, though, you would want to do something different. Like, why would I ever want anchors up here? Well, if I resize this parent object, you can see that the square in the center is keeping its distance from that anchor coordinate. That's how it's choosing where to position itself when you're resizing. So if for some reason your UI you want to resize it during runtime, so while your application is running, then anchors become really important because you want to make sure that your UI still looks nice, even if your parent or your canvas or whatever is resizing on the fly, like during runtime. If you know your UI is never going to resize, or your canvas or in this case a parent object is never going to resize, then anchors don't really matter too much except for maybe legibility. So it being easier to tell, like, it's easier to tell this object is in the center with these anchors than it is to tell the object is in the center with these anchors. This is just confusing, but it has its benefits if your UI is going to be changing sizes or scaling, anything like that. So that's kind of the point of anchors. The big fundamental anchors that you'll probably need as a beginner is to be able to resize an object to fill up the entire size of its parent. And the way we do that is we click on the so each of these stretches our object, or at least stretches the anchors to whatever it's representing. So let's look at this one first. So the anchors are stretched in the Y direction all the way to the top and bottom, and this little line right here means that in the X direction, the anchors are all the way to the left. So you can see that our anchors are stretched top and bottom, and they, in the X direction, they're all as far left as possible. This is the same thing, except in the X direction as far middle as possible and as far right as possible. And then we can do the same for stretching in the X direction. This is stretched completely in the X direction. Anchors are as far in the Y direction as possible, so as high up as possible, middle, bottom, and then you can see what each of these do. The images are pretty self-explanatory once you understand what they mean. And then finally, this just stretches your anchors to the far outside of your object. So that now, if I were to set all these values to 0, it fills up the entire parent. Now remember, this is relative to the parent, not to the canvas. So just to make that a little clearer, let's change this back to 300, 300. Let's say I add another panel as a child, right? Let's set this color to green. Let me change the alpha value. Let's set this size to 200 or 100. Okay, so it's centered right now. Now let's switch to stretch, right? So if I zero out these values, take a quick second and think, will this green square fill up this entire blue square or just fill up the red square? Take a second and think about that. You can pause to try to figure that out yourself. So the answer is it'll just fill up the red square because it is a child of the red square, right? And so these anchors are relative to the red square, not to the blue square, which is the parent of the red square. So let's see what happens when I move the panel. I change its parent to the background. Now, when I zero it out, it will fill up the entire background. So just something to keep in mind. It's relative to its parent. Anchors are always relative to the parent. So yeah. Besides that, one other thing to keep in mind with anchors. So let me quickly make this, again, something easier to see. So if I go into game view, you can see our UI here. This tab right here, and for you, it might say free aspect. It probably will say free aspect. This is the aspect ratio you're picking. So free aspect by itself isn't really an aspect ratio. It's just the default. And so if there's a specific target aspect ratio that you're planning on your application being used on. So let's say if it's Android, maybe this value right here, 400 by 800. iPhone might have a different aspect ratio. You can add one, by the way, right here. You just label it, and then you add a width and a height, 900 by 400, let's say, and it will create that aspect ratio. But let's just do 1920 by 1080. That's at least for a PC, that's kind of what you expect, maybe a TV too. So for 1920 by 1080, now that we have that set, let's go back to our scene view and let's mess around with the anchors a little bit. So let's say I want this object to be anchored to the top right, but I still want it to stay in the center, right? And let's leave this anchored in the center. Now, if I change that aspect ratio again, you'll see now that it's not even on screen anymore, right? And this is something to be really careful of. So your anchor, when you change the aspect ratio, is also going to move your objects accordingly to fit them into that aspect ratio. So since I anchored it to the top right, if we go back to scene view, it's going to keep that same distance from the top right, even if we change the aspect ratio, right? So this is still the exact position that object was in from the top right when it was 1920 by 1080. It did not move. But if we had centered, let's go back to 1920 by 1080. If we had centered that anchor, and then we had changed the aspect ratio, I forget exactly what I did, but I think it was this one. You can see now it is inside the image because the anchors are just keeping it in the center, and when we resize that aspect ratio, it's basically pushing everything into the center. So it's really important that you always want to start working in whatever your target aspect ratio is, especially working with UI, so that you can get a good idea of where all your objects are going to go. And as long as you're not targeting multiple aspect ratios, which for the most part you probably won't be, then you don't need to do anything else. Something I like to show people in case they are targeting multiple aspect ratios, if we go back to this canvas and we look at this canvas scalar object, let's say we're targeting a couple of different mobile device aspect ratios, then we can choose the scale with screen size and it will try to fit your objects based on the change in aspect ratio. But keep in mind, it's not perfect. Sometimes it can cause some weird looking behavior. So it's something you just need to play around with a little bit and find that nice looking solution. But so right now we're in 400 by 800, or I guess, yes, 400 by 800. So let's pick that as our aspect ratio, 400 by 800. Oops. So it's going to try to match this 400 by 800 with whatever new resolution or aspect ratio we do. You can also decide, do I want it to match width first and then height? Do I want it to match height first and then width, or somewhere in between? Let's just do width first and then height. And now let's see what it looks like when I pick similar aspect ratio, because again, it's not perfect, so you probably want to work with similar aspect ratios. So let me just add one real quick that's like 800 by 1200. And you can kind of see what happens when I try to match it by width or match it by height. And so you can kind of mess around and decide with what you like, but this canvas scaler will help you keep things consistent over multiple aspect ratios. But if you don't plan to do it on multiple devices or multiple aspect ratios, then again, I wouldn't worry about this. Just stay in constant pixel size and make sure you pick your your target aspect ratio. So we'll stay 1920 by 1080. Okay, so that's essentially all there is to anchors. We're actually not going to use them too much outside of this video and this tutorial because we're not planning on supporting multiple aspect ratios for our login page. And I'm actually going to delete these objects. But still, it's a very important foundation to have. And in future videos, you might see me move stuff around using those anchors. And I want to make sure that you understand my thought process and why I'm doing that. So yeah, look for my next video.